Yes, it's Halloween, and we've an evening of horror for you here on 4. At 11:30, David Bowie stars in a chilling tale of a latter-day vampire, The Hunger. And at 1:20, a village lives in fear of the vampire bat. Now we attempt to discover just why people enjoy being frightened by such films in fear in the dark.
Fear is the most powerful emotion in the human race, and fear of the unknown is probably the most ancient. So you're dealing with stuff that everybody's felt from being little babies. We're frightened of the dark, we're frightened of what we don't know about. And if you're making a horror film, you get to play with the audience's feelings.
A census taker once tried to test me. I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.
It's so much about this small but so brilliant spark of the unconscious which constantly wants to break out and say, hey, you know, I have some stuff to tell you which is far more interesting than this surface.
Come to Freddy.
I believe that by and large secrets are destructive and dangerous. I think Spalding Gray says whatever is hidden degenerates. So that a horror film has a tendency to make people face things that they don't want to face, and I think in that sense it's healthy. And in that sense it's very exciting. It's going into the labyrinth for the Minotaur.
When I first go in, there's that wonderful feeling of suspense and anticipation. Is this going to frighten me enough? It's like a kind of hunger.
Same kind of idea as going on roller coasters to make yourself feel sick.
Yeah,
and it's kind of fun.
Sit down, you watch a film in the dark, on your own space, and you try to endure the next 2 hours of, you know, whatever the film throws at you.
Fear, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, is a feeling of distress, apprehension or alarm caused by impending danger or pain, hardly the prescription for a pleasant or pleasurable experience. Yet since the world was young, men and women have indulged in and enjoyed the thrill which fear alone can provide. From the earliest fireside ghost stories to the big-budget blockbuster horror movies of today, we have entertained ourselves with terrifying visions drawn from our darkest nightmares. The eternal themes which haunt modern horror films were first successfully exploited in the Gothic novel. Dubbed the godfather of modern horror, Victorian writer Edgar Allan Poe is still a source of inspiration for today's leading horror directors.
È stata la prima grande lettura che ho fatto quando ero adolescente. Sono stato anche malato per questo, ho avuto per un sacco di tempo la febbre, come una strana febbre, che mi veniva da questi racconti, perché ero molto piccolo, avevo 10 anni, 11 anni quando li ho letti. Però penso che la stessa impressione ha fatto a molte altre persone. Terribile, anche crudele. E raccontare in realtà il mostro che è intorno a noi e dentro di noi, senza il realismo, ma raccontando il profondo, raccontando la nostra...
No, not the gun! I want to see your face again!
No matter how things change,
Our fears remain fairly constant. Our fears of death and dying, of pain and suffering, of cruelty, and above all, our fear of terror connected with the unknown. These are the things that Poe deals with, and deals with effectively, sometimes too effectively for comfort.
These same themes were seized on by early Gothic cinema, where apparitions drawn from European folklore made their screen debuts. Throughout the history of horror, key figures have recurred. Most enduring is the vampire, whose timeless appeal has been explained in a variety of wild and wonderful ways.
Fear and dread are so highly sexual, and the vampire is so romantic. It's all about obsession at the same time, which is full of all this incredible energy and focus and attention, and this feeding, all these glorious metaphors, which are all cloaked in these wonderful gestures and ambience.
You've got this tall, dark, usually handsome stranger, played by Christopher Lee, who penetrates the woman, who is usually a young, pretty, virginal sort of woman, in a very vulnerable part of the body, in this case happens to be the neck, after which he owns her. She becomes his, forevermore. It's quite clearly a seduction metaphor.
And this kind of grief, this sense of tragedy that he has about him, which is very attractive because women feel in his solitude that somehow that they can save this dark soul, There is something very private about a vampire in his dark isolation. And there's something very moving about that, too.
I think it's very significant that Dracula was written by a man who eventually died of syphilis because he couldn't get laid within his marriage. Certainly there's a feeling of sexual frustration that builds up within many classical ideas of the vampire myth. Currently, there is a wave, and I imagine this will be the great boring cliche of the 80s and 90s, is the AIDS vampire story. The idea of vampirism as a metaphor with a kind of the predatory sexuality or the spread of sexual disease.
They represent a triumph over death. While people dread them, at the same time, I think, have a certain secret envy of the fact that a vampire never dies. And this is connected with the mystery of death itself, and therefore exerts an endless fascination.
If the vampire preys upon eternal fears, then do other horror icons personify the anxieties of their time? King Kong has been described as expressing the pent-up rage of the Depression, while the success of Fritz Lang's Metropolis is attributed to the fear of advancing technology which haunted the 1920s.
At the time of the Cold War and nuclear anxieties leading up to the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have a lot of films about the effects of atomic radiation, making ants or huge, or bringing dinosaurs back from their frozen ice age. But also lots of films which reflect both the fear of communism and the fear of McCarthyism. Films like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Invaders from Mars. These are movies about dehumanization, about the kind of sinister things that perhaps lurk under the apparent normality of the American way of life.
In the 70s, the threat came not from outer space, but from the murky depths of our own world. We went swimming, and were attacked by sharks and piranhas. We put a down payment on a house and the walls dripped blood. We took a canoe trip and were raped and murdered by retarded hillbillies. Everywhere, the modern dream was turning to a nightmare.
The question asked by all 70s films is the same as that old thing you saw in annuals as a kid, where they'd show you a picture of a small town and then ask you, what's wrong with this picture? That's basically what all of the really good 70s horror movies do. They show you America and then ask you what's wrong with it. That's why we have the small town in Halloween, which harbors the mad killer. That's why we have the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. That's why we have The Exorcist.
In 1974, The Exorcist became the biggest grossing horror movie of all time. So startling was its impact that the film has never been shown on British television and is currently banned on video. Was its extraordinary success really just a sign of the times?
I don't believe that the mood of the times had anything whatever to do with the success of The Exorcist. I think it would have been successful at any time. At any time. Because, why? Because since the beginning of time, we have been concerned about these eternal questions. The nature of good and evil. Does God exist? Does the devil exist? How do we explain certain horrible things that happen to innocent people?
Reports of faintings, vomitings, suicides, miscarriages and murder haunted the film's release. Hyped by media hysteria, audiences prepared themselves to be taken to new limits of terror.
I was anticipating the feeling before I sat down and watched it, so I was already scared. You know, I knew I was going to feel scared. When you know you're going to be scared, you start being scared anyway, for no particular reason. You know, I was absolutely terrified.
I don't think it was that frightening a film, but, you know, I'd built it up in my own mind to such an extent that I was quite nervous about watching it.
If you're walking down a dark street at night, okay, and you heard that there was a murder on that street, you're going to be frightened while you're walking down the street. If you haven't heard there's a murder on the street, you probably won't be frightened. To a large extent, The Exorcist worked that way. By the time the first week was over, word got around that it was like walking down a street where there had been a crime. People were scared before they got into the theater.
As its horrifying reputation grew, The Exorcist drew record-breaking crowds. So why are we drawn to, rather than repelled by, the experience of fear?
What a horror film then does is not frighten so much as release fright. It is a vent, and that all these fears are in us all the time, from our lives, from our youths, from the world at large, from everything from the most complex societal things of waging war and class struggle to very simple primal things like fear of father and mother and fear of abandonment as a child. So these are all inherent in us, and civilization tends to gloss them over, encapsulate them, deny them. It teaches us a thousand ways to act like everything's fine, but underneath the surface is this sort of cauldron. So what a horror film does is tap in and release that tension, and it does it in a way that's entertaining, amusing, exciting, and safe.
You can go out and get like a cheap thrill, and you're not going to catch AIDS from it, or the clap, you know, or probably not any permanent or lasting damage.
When we detect a threat in the environment, our brain activates the glandular system to produce chemicals into the blood, such as adrenaline and noradrenaline. And these have a variety of effects, such as increasing heart rate, respiration. They give us sweaty palms, pallor, butterflies in the stomach, perhaps dilation of the pupils, and usually connected with raising of the eyebrows and opening of the eyes, which is to increase your visual acuity, so you can take more in of the environment, and that will help you solve the threat. But some people go the other way, and they will actually either block off their eyes physically, because it's something so horrible they don't want to see it, or their pupils will constrict so as to close it out.
Your heart beats faster. Your breathing becomes more drawn and deliberate. And it's a very involving experience. You can actually feel it physically. I find that very, very enjoyable and quite exhilarating.
Your heart just pounds, your hairs prickle up on the back of your neck, and you get like tingling sensations running through you.
My stomach would just close up when I'd see this really scary movie. I'd like pick my feet up off the ground, and I'd clutch the sides of the seats, and I'd just be sitting there like, just rigid with fear.
You sit there and you confront the source of your fear, and you don't actually run away from it, because you look a bit silly running up the center aisle or clambering over the person next to you. You sit there and suffer it, hopefully, if you don't cover your eyes, that is. And ultimately, you are better placed to cope with that fear should it happen to you in real life.
Nowadays, if you see a horror film, you can go into school and tell your friends about all the best bits, like, oh yes, his arm came off.
Yeah. Yeah, I suppose it's all to do with, you know, telling friends and boasting.
Mm. Yeah, and they'll want to see the film then and boast. And there are people who don't like horror films. If you boast to them about what you've seen and they can't watch it, it makes you sort of feel more sort of manly, like. I suppose it's like smoking cigarettes and makes you feel tough, and watching horror films makes you feel tough.
The posters that you see of horror films is like, can you take this? And this is the nastiest, grossest thing you've ever seen. And yeah, sure, people go because they want to say, yeah, I can take it. Yeah, show me it, I can take it.
I think the audiences that enjoy horror movies or being scared are usually younger, and they are coming to grips with a lot of fears of their own. They're maturing, they're becoming adults, they're either going through puberty, or they're getting to be teenagers or in their 20s. And in a sense, it's an emotional roller coaster. And you get to experience a lot of the things that are going on inside of you and get them out, actually exercise them.
During the 50s, movies were marketed toward teenage audiences for whom movie houses offered a unique attraction. Unable to find privacy at home, teenage couples took to the cinema, where horror films provided a perfect backdrop for them to get better acquainted over the popcorn.
I think what's fun about being in a horror movie with my boyfriend is that there's this terrible feeling of being utterly exposed to fear and being completely vulnerable, which I think, then again, is a sexual thing.
That's a time when boys pretty much get excited, I guess. It gives them the opportunity for a girl to get close to them more, I don't know.
I think that they know that a girl wants to grab onto them.
Right.
And just last Friday, I went to Sleeping with the Enemy with a boyfriend, and I could see that he was sitting up higher in his chair, and we got out of the film, and I screamed the whole way through, and he came out of the film like piece of cake, you know, no big deal. And the whole time I was grabbing onto his arm, he probably has claw marks.
The introduction of television forced the industry to desperate lengths to push its product. William Castle's pitch for Macabre in 1958 included insuring the audience with Lloyds in case any of them should die of fright. For the first run of The Tingler, some cinema seats were actually wired to deliver a mild electric shock.
I am William Castle, the director of the motion picture you're about to see. I feel obligated to warn you that some of the sensations, some of the physical reaction which the actors on the screen will feel will also be experienced for the first time in motion picture history by certain members of this audience. At any time you are conscious of a tingling sensation, you may obtain immediate relief by screaming.
But gimmicks are just that, and their impact upon an audience quickly wears thin. The real masters of cinema have their own ploys to hold an audience enthralled.
One classic technique is to create a sense of threat for the audience, no matter what you use. Sometimes it's music, situation, lighting, whatever it may be, all the tools that you would use to say something bad is about to happen. Then what you do is throw in a false threat, something, a terrible sound, which the audience, it's a cat, it's a leaf fell, a twig broke, an object fell off the thing, or a door creaked, or it was a click, or whatever. Nothing. The audience says, oh, pow! Then you hit him. That just knocks the shit out of everybody.
Other horror filmmakers have delighted in breaking the boundaries of taste, shocking their audiences by splattering the screen with blood and gore.
I recall a movie back in the early 60s before the culture changed, when we were still living in the 50s in America. There was a film called Blood Feast by Herschel Gordon Lewis, which was maybe the first splatter movie, pulling tongues out and just grotesque violence. I saw it when I was a teenager, and it was very disturbing. But he did it because the country was so conservative, because he wanted to slap us in the face and say, you know, look at this stuff.
Blood Feast had tapped into a vein from which would flow a stream of splatter movies.
Like if I hear on the street, like, yeah, there's a good one out where like people are losing their heads, I won't go see it because of that. But if I hear it's got like, it's, you know, well made and it's got good plot in it, then I'll go see it. But I don't think blood and gore attracts people to movie theaters.
I tend to enjoy horror films with lots of gore and blood all over the place, such as Toxic Avenger, where some weight trainer gets a load of weights smashed through his head.
Some people seem to look at me in disbelief when I can sit down and eat my dinner in front of a film that's having somebody's head, brain eaten as in bad taste, or one of the ultimate gore films like that, or Society. I can actually eat in front of it, and people tend to look at me and think I'm very strange because they can't really stomach it.
Whilst many horror movies became notorious for their relentlessly gory content, each vying to be nastier than the last, one film in the 70s stood out from the pack, setting new, shocking standards.
In 1976, I saw a film that I thought went right up to the line of taste, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It rode the taste line that separates something unspeakably awful from something that you can handle. And I recall after I saw it, I went to sleep and I slept like a baby because it had sort of pacified my soul. I was able to go down to the depths of human depravity and come out and not really be damaged by it. And that's a movie for its time, I think, that worked perfectly well.
The first time you see Texas Chainsaw Massacre, you think, oh my God, you know, this is terrible, this is completely unbearable and awful. It's the most gruesome, graphic, gory thing I've ever seen. But the second time you see it, you really wonder if you're seeing a cut version of it. And I think what has happened there is you've imagined all sorts of things in your mind, which you thought were in the film, but actually they weren't there at all. So the film isn't all that graphic and gory, but it's extremely suggestive.
I've always felt that suggestion is a much more effective way of evoking fright than the explicit. Because after all, ketchup is ketchup. And if you leave that sort of image to the imagination, it will come up with a much more spicy specimen.
The old argument that if you didn't show it, you know, people would just imagine something worse. Well, that's the very point. That's exactly why you show it. Take an example in the works of David Cronenberg. How do you imagine the vaginal slit that appears in the middle of Max Wren's stomach in Videodrome off screen? I mean, it's very difficult to see how that's worked out. I suppose you could have somebody come on and sort of just simply describe it in sort of shocked look, you know, but you need to see those things. I have no impatience with the sort of 1950s style of movie in which, you know, in the first hour you see a footprint, in the second hour you see, you see a claw, and in the last 5 minutes you see the creature before it's destroyed by an atom bomb. I mean, I have no interest in that idea of showing monsters. Monsters seem to me to be the thing I go to a movie to see. Actually, at the beginning of Hellraiser, I'm almost showing some of the worst stuff that happens in the entire movie within the first 2 minutes of the movie. And what happens, I hope, is that by the end of the picture, by the time you get to the climax, actually, of both Nightbreed and Hellraiser, your familiarity with the beasts, your familiarity with the strange creatures, allows you to assess them in a different way.
In Hellraiser, when you first see the Cenobites, your initial reaction is, oh God, they're awful. But as they're more on screen, you actually build up like a feeling with them. You identify with them, yeah. And you actually feel that Pinhead is quite a sad character. He's not, you know, a wicked evil man. There's something there that's made him like that.
I certainly get a lot of letters from people who think that Pinhead in Hellraiser, for all his strange disfigurements, is sexy, endearing. There are more things going on, in other words, in these kind of strange disfigurements and changes than simply saying, oh, this is disgusting, this is repulsive.
I think there's a line in movies the audience is frightened you're going to cross, that you're going to show them something that they can't stand, that they can't take. And they're very fearful of that. They don't want to see something that's going to really hurt them badly, because they'll get angry and they'll leave your film and they won't get anything else from it. They'll defend themselves against what they're seeing. You have to always play that line very carefully with audiences, and you have to go up to it. If you cross it, I think you lose them, and you lose them badly.
No, I don't understand people who go to horror films and keep their eyes shut at the worst bits, because that's the whole point. Because the most terrifying the moment is, the more I want to keep my eyes open, because it's exciting.
I really try and be scared, because I believe that a good horror film should hypnotize you into watching it, since you can't turn it off. You're just sort of like stuck with the film.
More than any other genre, horror has had to struggle to stay ahead of the changing tastes and sensitivities of its audience. This has brought it into regular conflict with the senses. In the 50s, it was horror comics that bore the brunt of the senses attacks. In that era, horror comics were seen by their detractors as nothing less than a plot to corrupt the youth of the free world.
These comic book covers that you are seeing here are a sample of what the children of the United States are reading today.
One of the wonderfully appealing things about children is that they haven't yet come to the age where reality and unreality are divorced. The emotional impact of something they read in a comic book may be much the same as a real-life situation they witness. Horror and crime comics upset kids. You can see the tension develop as the story gets more gruesome. And if it's a bad one, the kid has a mass of jangled nerves by the time he's through it. You want to give me your name, son?
David Freeman.
And how old are you?
11.
Tell me how comic books make you feel, Dave.
Well, they don't make me feel too good. A couple of times I read a comic book, I threw up.
There are certain scenes I wouldn't want to do in a film. If you combine sexuality and say a horror film, you have to be very careful, because you don't want to promote behavior in people. But that's an unfortunate problem that we find too, is that a lot of people watch these movies, begin to imitate it. You have to be aware of that. People will go to a movie, and if they're disturbed, and whatever they see, whether it's a comedy or whether it's a Western, or whether it's a horror movie, they will incorporate some of that into their thinking. I had a telephone call about 6 months ago from a guy who wanted to meet the Shape from Halloween. And the secretary told him it was an actor. He said, no, I want to meet the guy, Michael Myers. I want to meet the character who's killed all these people. So the difference between fantasy and reality in this guy's mind was a very thin bridge. If you decide, look, the story needs this, I have to do it, then you've got to go ahead and do it, but be aware of the consequences.
But can horror fiction really inspire horrific acts, or does it merely mirror the atrocities of real life? From the time when Jack the Ripper prowled the narrow streets of London's East End, any series of spectacular murders has been guaranteed to spawn a slew of books and movies. The figure of the lone psychopath in particular has unique hold on our imaginations.
I believe that the horror of the serial killer can be capsulized in one phrase. He could be the person standing next to you.
On November the 17th, 1957, police discovered in the farmyard home of Edward Gein a playpen of horror beyond the imaginings of any Hollywood nightmare. Severed limbs and organs were preserved in jars, and dismembered torsos hung beside masks made from human flesh.
As I recall, there were a number of reactions that remain vivid in my memory to this day when the crimes were perpetrated in Plainfield, Wisconsin. They varied from utter horror to complete disbelief, because at that time the mass murderer, the serial killer, was a somewhat unknown quantity in our society.
If a farmer, the trusted figure from the American heartland, could be a psychopath, then it seemed that anyone could. Amidst this dizzying climate of uncertainty, Alfred Hitchcock's terrifying classic, Psycho, ushered in a new era of horror.
People were generally unprepared for what they were about to see, and when they did see it, they were unprepared to deal with it. During the early showings, I found that it was better to use earplugs if possible, because there's such an amount of screaming going on that it was quite unnerving to me.
It scared the hell out of me, and it still does. I've seen it recently, and it's still a wonderful experience. I guess it gets at certain primal fears. It single-mindedly goes after the audience and finally wrests you to the ground. I mean, it still has that power.
In the United States, since 1977, serial killings have risen enormously, and something's going on.
As the list of real-life serial killers grew longer, so fictional psychopaths continued to dominate our fantasies. Almost invariably, their victims were marginally wayward suburban teenagers who had tasted the forbidden fruits of sex.
One of the common shortcomings of horror films or genre films can be that they are sort of stringent moral tales, whereby if you have sex, you'll die. If you smoke dope, you'll die. If you do something that your parents tell you not to do, you'll die.
The Michael Myers films, as I call them, Halloween, you get the promiscuous teenagers. And because they've been a bit naughty, they have to die. That's very sort of blunt prudery, if you like. But I don't think it's even that. It's a director or a writer setting up a situation that somebody has to be killed. A little bit of sex there just to make it a bit more interesting for the audience, you know, and then it wipes out. I don't think there's any conscience there. It's just, it's not as well thought through as you might think. It just isn't.
When are human beings most vulnerable? You take off your clothes, go to the bathroom, get in the shower, or you're making love with someone. Sexual situations. That's when you don't have any armor on. That's when you're not thinking about what's going on. It's just an obvious choice.
I had a couple in a book years ago who went into the woods to make love, and both were married to different people, and these people were destroyed mid-act. But that wasn't me saying, you know, they have to be damned because they're up to no good. That is just an interesting scenario for me. There they were in the woods, and they were surrounded by these beasts. What better way to go?
I think that our culture's got a really strange kind of ambivalence about female sexuality. We desire what we hate, or we hate what we desire, you know, because because there's this element of fear in what we desire. Because what will it do? Maybe it'll annihilate us.
E nella bellezza del fisico della donna, anche non quando non è bellissima, ma nella sua femminilità c'è qualcosa di così profondo, di così insondabile che mi affascina e voglio conoscerlo, voglio capirlo.
Freddy Krueger was unique among his contemporaries, for he preyed upon both the boys and the girls of Elm Street without regard for their morality. He was an equal opportunities killer.
It's not as easy to terrify or horrify the reader or the viewer with some simple act of understandable violence. It has to be something superhuman, Freddy Krueger, that type of embodiment of evil, in order to really register an impact.
Who are you?
Freddy represented sort of, in one sense, the bad karma of the parents. The parents had done something illegal, immoral, and when the results of that came back on them, that is, when this man started coming into their children's nightmares, instead of forthrightly saying, we did something horrible, they acted like they didn't know what they were talking about. And worse, they acted like their kids were crazy.
Fred Krueger, Mom. Fred Krueger. Do you know who that is, Mother? Because if you do, you better tell me, because he's after me now.
Nancy, trust your mother for once, please. You'll feel better when you get some sleep.
I think that is something that's not so far from what society does when it says, for instance, rock and roll is crazy. The kids must be crazy. I don't know what's wrong with this generation. They're so wild. But the generation is really rebelling against what the society has set up as living conditions or as the way things are.
Freddy's gruesome sarcasm and relentless nihilism struck a chord with the post-punk generation. He quickly turned from monster to hero, a grotesque movie idol complete with merchandising.
The Nightmare on Elm Street films, the character Freddy. I mean, when that first came out, how anyone could ever sympathise with a character like that. But it's the amount of people, his popularity is phenomenal. You know, T-shirts, everything you can get. You know, they've got their own show in America now, Freddy's show, and the kids are going mad on him.
It kind of got messed up when they kept on making another one. Because after the second one, at least people wanted to see another one because the first one was so good. And the third one, people were kind of tired of seeing the same guy come back to the same children. And their kids, it was kind of stupid. If you have Freddy and then Jason, there's 8 of them. Yeah, Friday the 13th, and he goes to New York. Next he's going to LA, and then he's going to Japan, you know. He's like on tour.
Nightmare on Elm Street, you just realize that it couldn't happen in a true story that was made into a horror film. Those are the worst ones, because you can never say, oh, that wasn't real, and you can never block it out of your mind. It's always there.
Inspired by multiple murderer Henry Lee Lucas, Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, left behind the fantasy of Elm Street and led us into the horrifyingly mundane world of the urban psychopath.
Horror film means certain types of films with monsters and fantasy, et cetera, where we try to go back to the root of the word, horror. How do we, if this is a horror film, then its intent must be to horrify its audience. And so we tried to think how best to horrify an audience, and we chose a device, and the device we chose was realism.
You kill at a high school boy, they're going to slap your ass right back in jail. Just that's a promise. I mean, people have seen you together.
I'd still like to kill him, though.
I bet you would.
I'd like to kill somebody.
Say that again.
I'd like to kill somebody.
Must mean you go for a ride, Otis.
Down in our hearts, we know that these are people doing this, slaughtering people. And the question is why? What's happening? Why is it going so crazy now? Why does human life have so little value? That's a very frightening idea.
Sorry we wasted your time. Come on, Otis.
Don't give me sorry, you dumbass. Did I stutter? Give me the $50 and get out!
There's this like little gate, little emotional gate that, you have this urge that rises up, and there were times that urge arose in me that I could have just like jumped up and beat someone to death over, a traffic altercation or something. But of course you don't. I mean, most human beings don't. But there are those of us that are through birth or through the unfortunateness of their circumstance in life, is if we're to believe what Henry has said about his life, sort of either we're born without that little gate that prevents you from crossing that line, or else it just gets worn away. We showed a family being slaughtered in what we felt to be a very realistic and ugly fashion. It was to say, okay, this is probably what it's really like, and it's very sort of small and ugly and repulsive and sickening. Here's violence and murder as it probably really might look like, and it's not at all entertaining. It's just totally sickening.
I think we're now getting into the era of movies like Blue Steel, where we're worried about stockbrokers. I think that's perhaps the next big wave, as is represented by, for instance, Sleeping with the Enemy, or Bret Easton Ellis' novel American Psycho. These are about what's wrong with rich people. We aren't talking about the marginalized Jasons and Michael Myers and Freddys here, the guys who've always been in the gutter and are fighting back. We're now talking about psychos in designer clothes. Psychos who make more money than you and I will ever see, doing absolutely nothing, and then spend their nights killing people.
It was no longer good enough for fictional serial killers to be mindlessly homicidal. They were expected to have a personality. The Silence of the Lambs broke box office records. At the heart of its appeal lay the complex character of urbane evil genius, Hannibal the Cannibal Lecter.
You know who he is, don't you? Tell me who decapitated your patient, Doctor.
All good things to those who wait.
As on-screen gore became unfashionable and splatter movies gave way to psycho chillers, the special effects technology once used to produce dismembered body parts was put to different effect by the pioneers of a new form of horror.
I believe that there will always be new and novel ways to dismember and gore out a body. I do think that it starts losing a lot of its shock appeal. And I believe that there is a great audience for the more surreal forms. And I think that Nightmare on Elm Street did a great deal to advance that. If you'll remember the scene in Nightmare on Elm Street where the girl picks up the telephone and Freddy's tongue sticks into her mouth. Well, that's surrealism. It's not EC Comics. You're talking plastic reality here.
Creatively, special effects can provide far more than just the ability to depict blood and gore. They can make possible the impossible and give physical form to the filmmaker's wildest imaginings.
The role of special effects, I think, has really grown dramatically in the last 10 years, perhaps. I believe that it has to do with what I call the invasion of the rubber guys. What they are doing is exploiting certain materials that have been developed to a great degree in the past 10 or 15 years, specifically methacellulose, foam latex, and certain types of acetate applications. In society, there's definitely an attempt to shock the audience, to really push it to the limit and see how far we could go with a fairly limited bag of tricks. I enjoy shocking an audience. I think it's a lot of fun.
Well, son, I guess you're right. I am a butthead. Hey, Bill.
If special effects are the reason to make a movie, the tail is wagging the dog, and you know it's the wrong way around. But I also love being in the company of a bunch of special effects guys with that gleam in their eye that says they've had a new idea and they know a new way of turning someone inside out through their rectum, and they can do it all in one shot for you, Governor. I mean, that's a joy.
Although the audience's desire for terror seems insatiable, few viewers are ready to leave the cinema without some final reassurance. In the end, the monster is almost invariably dispatched to hell, the ghosts are laid to rest, and normality is restored.
You get to experience all this carnage or whatever bad stuff the perpetrator is perpetrating, and to sort of revel in it. But they're punished in the end, so you can feel morally responsible, and then that the world is a safe place and there is sense in the universe.
Die. Son of a bitch!
And wouldn't we sort of like to believe that some of the things that happen in horror fiction were plausible, even though the consequences of them may be terrible within a particular drama? It might nevertheless be rather reassuring to know that the devil existed, because then, by extension, so would God. It might be rather reassuring to know that zombies can indeed break in through the French windows, because, well, at least there's life after death.
I consider movies today to be the equivalent of sitting around the campfire and telling stories, 1,000, 2,000 years ago. It's no different. We have to tell our stories, and we have to tell them to each succeeding generation, which is why we all get a chance to make movies if we'd like, because there's always a new group to tell the same old stories to.
When the end credits go up, there's a feeling of almost like a real high. It's like having a terrifying dream, but when you wake up, it's, I can tell people about it, this is great. If I can go through this and I can tackle anything, if I can go right down to what's frightening me, right deeply in my unconscious, then I feel like I've conquered something.
After I've seen a horror film, I usually really do tend to feel relieved and so thankful that it's finished. But I go back and see horror films again, because I like horror films.
When you come out of the film afterwards, even if it did scare you and have you on edge, you say, that film got me. I enjoyed that. So you go back and do it again.
There's always sort of a feeling of relief when you're done watching it. Just like it's over and, you know, it's done with.
Scary movies give you like a whole new mood. When you leave the theater, you just feel so much more relaxed.
I've never read or seen anything that I regretted afterwards. I think that people can take anything. You know, that your capacity to receive fear is absolutely huge, and that horror films so far have only just touched on it. You know, I'm waiting for something more.
This Channel 4 video, Fear in the Dark, is available in shops now.